Alias MacAlias. And tell us, Hines said, do you know that fellow in the... Fellow was over there in the... He looked around. Macintosh, yes, I saw him. Where is he now? Mentosh, Hines said, scribbling. I don't know who he is. Is that his name? He moved away, looking about him. No, Mr. Bloom began, turning and stopping. I say, Hines. Didn't hear. What? Where has he disappeared to? Not a sign. Well, of all the... Has anyone here seen K-E-double-L become invisible? Good Lord. What became of him? James Joyce, Ulysses, Hades episode. The man in the Macintosh. Don't you believe a word he says. That man is Leopold Macintosh, the notorious fire raiser. His real name is Higgins. The Uncanny Scot, a selection of prose by Hugh MacDiarmiad, edited with an introduction by Kenneth Boufflé, McGibbon and Key 1968, will here be reviewed by Hamish Henderson. A lot of young Americans come to Scotland nowadays. Some look for ancestors, and there is no doubt that many can be aided to find them. Others are after live prey, such as literary nobilities, and in no time their attention is drawn to a venerable standing stone in the middle distance. A native guide is easily procured, and in no time they are taking part in group Neolithic rite, well saturated in mountain dew. The more computer-minded man becomes, the more is he likely to go a-whoring after the numinous, the title which Mr. Boufflé has chosen for his admirable selection of prose pieces by Hugh MacDiarmiad has, therefore, a peculiar aptness and reverberation, an aptness indeed which quite transcends the mildly juckle word-play which probably suggested it in the first place. MacDiarmiad is not one of the best living European poets. He is also, for better or worse, the above-mentioned standing stone, or better maybe, a sort of glorified totem pole of the tribe, a new and in many ways more potent cult figure than Scotland's superannuated loved one, poor stuffed, cosmeticized and mummified rabbi, now far gone in Kearney faction. It would be a macabre Scotch joke of precisely the kind that MacDiarmiad himself so keenly appreciates, see the doer drinkers of Glasgow, if the dead-weight mantle of Burns' cult Burns were to fall in the latter end on his own shoulders. The only other characters who would be in the running for this dubious honour is, of course, none other than the great McGonagall himself, about whom MacDiarmiad has an essay in The Uncanny Scot. For MacDiarmiad, McGonagall is not a good poet. For MacDiarmiad, McGonagall is not a good bad poet. He is just not a poet at all. Here I am convinced MacDiarmiad is doing McGonagall an injustice. The Bard of Dundee is certainly a kind of poet, and his work, to quote Flecker's Hassan, has a monstrous beauty, like the backside of an elephant. The fall with a thickening thud, the sustained belly flop, which is the distinguished feature of McGonagall's verse, has much in common with the compulsive grotesquerie of many of the pedestrian Irish come-all-ye's brought across to Scotland in their hundreds in the last century by immigrant Irish workers like McGonagall's father. These contain, in degenerate form, a whole battery of motifs and techniques which descend ultimately from Gaelic poetry. In any case, the Langholm by-spell seems to me to have much more in common with McGonagall than he himself probably realises, or would care to admit. I do not only mean that he has written a lot of belly-flop poetry over the years, although even his most fervent admirers would admit that he has done so. I mean that his customary poetic stance, at a slight angle to the universe, is also often reminiscent of the attitudes and predilections of an offbeat Scoto-Irish popular tradition, of which McGonagall's work, there is no use denying it, does form part. In quite a number of didactic poems in which MacDiarmiad parades gewgaws of learning, acquired jackdaw-wise, he makes a convincing impression of a sort of Babu McGonagall. As he would not wish us to be nice with him, see the doer drinkers again. Let us put it even more bluntly. Chris Grieve, in one of his personae at least, appears very like the gangrel bard of no regard in Burns' song, appears, indeed, like a broadside hack of genius who ransacks everything from the folk idiom to the latest edition of the encyclopedia, and turns all to his own purpose. One of his favourite parts is the Autolycus, and no poet in either hemisphere can hold a candle to him as a snapper-up of unconsidered trifles. There is in fact a curious protean quality about Graves' work. He can change into many characters, and is just as capable of writing bad poetry as of writing good. Sometimes these characters take on new names, noms de guerre rather than noms de plume, as Buffalo has himself judiciously noted elsewhere. One recalls in this connection an article by Murray Maclaren, which appeared in the New Statesman 2 or 3 years ago. It was entitled MacAlias, and it drew attention to the well-known penchant of Scottish poets and writers for operating under cover of pseudonyms. A surprising number have chosen and still choose to adopt a new moniker, and by the same token an alter ego. It sometimes appeared as if they feel a definite need to do so. We are here on the edge of a gay, debatable land, and must walk warily. It is never easy to draw a hard and fast line between the popular arts and the elite arts of individual excellence, owing to the constant fruitful interaction of folk song and art literature in our tradition. We're often faced with the sort of set-up in which no one can say for sure where MacAlias ends and Anonymous begins. A sort of friendly communal cannibalization has therefore been the rule rather than the exception in Scottish literature. Art poets have operated like folk poets, in appropriating lines or even whole stanzas from earlier or contemporary authors, or of course from anon, and using them as a basis for their own productions. It can work the other way too, naturally. You get people like Ossian Macpherson, who, having written original works of literature, try to palm them off on someone else. Also modest characters who seek to hide their well-proportioned identities under bulging fig leaves, like the author of Waverley. The situation occasionally allows 2 or more turns of the screw, as when the disguised poet not only calls himself something else, but actually turns out to be someone else into the bargain. A classic example of this came to light in 1964 during the correspondence in the TLS about the much-praised and anthologized poem Perfect. I found a pigeon's skull on the MacAlias. Here it transpired that, in the case of this poem at least, Hugh MacDiarmiad was the pseudonym not only of Christopher Murray Grave, but also of a Welsh novelist and short story writer who had actually written the words to which MacDiarmiad gave poetic shape, thus affording them a new and more permanent habitation and a name. This is a phenomenon for which we need to invent a designation, and I'd like to suggest Alias MacAlias as an appropriate name for the two-headed bard. Alternatively, we might identify him with the thoroughly waterproof, but even so somewhat uncanny figure, Mentos, the 13th mourner at Paddy Dignam's funeral in Joyce's Ulysses. If ever there is a MacAlias supper, I look forward with relish to proposing the immortal memory. As John Sparrow pointed out during the TLS controversy, the best single comment on this whole imbroglio was provided years ago by MacDiarmiad himself in a dramatised sketch in Scots reprinted in the Uncanny Scot called The Purple Patch. A new minister has included a most peculiar utterance in his sermon which made Fred's and Stewart o' the rest o't. As the congregation scales, 3 groups of parishioners discuss the whys and wherefores of this unaccountable visitation. It is left to Heb Duncan, the veteran beadle, to provide the solution at the end of the sketch. You ken that muckle purple passage in the middle o't? Weel, when Dr. Gilruth was writing, he found yin o' his bit sheets of paper half full to start with a passage he'd been copying for that fantastical divine, Dr. Donne, a great Yankee revivalist, if I remember rightly, and absent-minded like that, thought that he'd just written it as per to his sermon. So he tacked on the rest to the end o't. He never noticed it the first time he delivered it, but I spotted the cuckoo i' the nest, and when he gied it a second time, I speered why he keep it in the passage that had nae connection with the rest of the sermon of I. Man, I never noticed it, he said, and then he tell't me who it must have happened. But I'll just leave it there, he added. It may be an accident, or it may be the hand of God. It'll no do ony ill in either case. Them that comes to the kirk in a richt frame o' mind'll never notice that ony thing's amiss, and them that do notice'll be puzzled to death to ken what to mak o' it. Irony is heaped on irony and compounded when one recollects that in 1962, before the TLS storm broke, Walter Keir edited an article in MacDiarmid's 70th birthday festdrift by quoting Perfect and remarking, "There's really nothing to add to that." Where the MacAlias of MacAlias is concerned, these are always likely to be famous last words. Indeed, in Greaves' later work, Hugh MacDiarmid is not so much a pseudonym as a trademark which appears stamped on such items as the poet considers worthy of being displayed to the public in the trundling, top-heavy co-op Pantechnicon, which transports his productions. Borrowing one of MacDiarmid's own titles, we can express the thing succinctly in one short formula. The kind of poetry I want equals the kind of poetry I take. Lewis Grassic Gibbon, another MacAlias, evidently had much the same approach to the subject when, as Oliver Brown has convincingly shown, he took the stuffing out of a clumsy German mattress in order to produce a much superior article of his own. Nobody who reads the two books, Jorn Ull and Sunset Song, can doubt for an instant that he was absolutely justified in so doing. Plagiarists of genius are the justified sinners of literature. If the operation is aesthetically successful, we need not worry about conventional proprieties. Here again MacDiarmid has the most telling comment to offer. It will be found in the 6th stanza of the first hymn to Lenin. The poet was addressing Lenin, of course, but he might just as well have been addressing Gibbon. Descendant of the unkent bard Swanade, sangs peerless through the post-anonymous days. I glimpse again in you that mightier poor than fascists with the laurels and the bays, but kens that it is shared by ilka man since time began. One or two of the 7 vernacular sketches included in the Uncanny Scot provide evidence that when he was on form and in the mood, MacDiarmid could write a Scots prose every bit as rich, vivid and evocative as the best of Scott Galt or the Ettrick Shepherd, and much better, in my opinion, than the Scots queer lingo of Gibbon, whose strange hybrid Scots-English has been one thing about his work which has always left me unsatisfied. I prefer the wine of the country neat, and a full flavoured local malt at that, the sort we get in the following passage from the best Scots sketch in the present selection. In front of the waterside houses, the bed of the river was full o' muckle flat shelves o' rock that had the factory gullets that cup up the water into a' kinds of loops and skirts and slivers and gushes, with 2 free deep channels in atween them, through the main flows gad solid and was. Say in the simmer time or bricht winter days the houses alang the waterside were aye full o' a' licht and life that made the ongoings of their inhabitants o' as little consequence as the ongoings o' the rats in the cellars were to them, and the dunt and dirl o' the river was in them like the hurt in a man, and they had the shoals o' licht, and the crazy casting o' the clouds, and the endless squabble o' the gulls in them, for mair even than the folk talking and the bairns playing. Alang the waterside they were windy, thrustless, flee about craters. The sense was clean washed out of them, a' the sense and a' the stupidity too. It's only some kinds of birds that hae e'en like what theirs became, cold and clear wi' nae humanity in them ava. This is first rate, deserves to be better known, but not all the vernacular sketches are up to that standard. MacDiarmid's prose is as unequal as his verse. Apart from the last great Burns discovery, a gorgeous comic send-up to the cult, The pre-1939 pieces in English would hardly merit a second reading if one did not have prior knowledge that they were by the author of A Drunk Man, The Hymns of Lennon, and Stony Limits. 5 Bits of Miller 1934 is an uncomfortably curiosity. It reads in places like an anticipatory parody of Spike Milligan's Bakun, especially the bit about the blackhead, and Miller's clock face dropping off and disclosing the works. The best single essay in the book, in my opinion, is The Doer Drinkers of Glasgow, which subjects the barbaric black humour of Calvinistic Scotland, the recalcitrant, the sinister, the malignant, the sarcastic, the saturnine, the cross-grained, and the cankered, to a surgical going over, as it were, from the inside. This piece, beautifully written and constructed, and operating on several different levels of irony, is a 5-star example of that sustained gaze directed at the bridge of the nose which, as MacDiarmiad has observed elsewhere, is the most exacerbating form of regard. A swatch of polemical prose which I missed, and which might well have rated inclusion in preference to some of the items chosen, is A Soldier's Farewell to Maurice Lindsay, published in a National Weekly in 1952 or thereabouts. If this is not the most devastating arschtritt in literary history, we may allow it to hold the title meantime until a new champ appears, to the sound of the trump. Scottish International, 1969.